We were standing in the shadows outside the entrance to a long, dark, twisting tunnel, off in the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius. Off in the distance, I could see the parliament buildings, but in front of us were a group of guards. They were with the Lithuanian National Defense Volunteer Forces. They were wearing uniforms that looked like something that we would buy in a costume shop. But their faces had a sense of commitment on them that had been years in the making and was not fleeting. I realized that the tunnel that we were in front of was being used to whisk people safely underneath the barricades in and out of the parliament buildings, and we were about to enter. This was July of 1991. I was 18 years old. The Lithuanian people had declared to the Soviets that they wanted independence. This declaration struck at the foundation of the principles of the Soviet Union and was part of the forces that propelled this country, the region, and the whole world into a time of revolutionary change. I was there with a group of Canadian leaders asking the question of how higher education could be rethought after the collapse of the social and political fabrics of Soviet society. Being in this emerging revolutionary time sparked a question in me, one that I want to ask you here today. It's a question of how we conduct ourselves in moments of revolution. It's a question about people and purpose. Whether we recognize it or not, I think we are all in a time of revolutionary change right now. This revolutionary change has been years in the making and impacts us all. And some have labeled it the fourth industrial revolution, a time when the physical, biological, and digital are blurring. As I entered that tunnel in a time of uncertainty in the past, we all are entering our own tunnel now. We stand in the shadows outside. We duck as we enter. We wonder where it will take us. We wonder what role we'll play as we navigate its twists and turns. But we know that the choices that we're going to make now will impact our future. If you're like me, your relationships, your work, your organizations are being reimagined under the weight of the revolutionary technological and communication change. The way that we work and engage now would be unrecognizable to our great-grandparents. As we look down the road and the slight twists and turns of this time, I'm convinced that this is our revolution. In Lithuania, the revolution was obvious. The signs were everywhere. The sides were clear. The Soviets had their tanks and their guns. The citizens had their flowers and their songs. Which side of the revolution are we on? To answer that question, we can ask a question. What are people for? It's an unusual question. We don't ask it often. Maybe try it at a family gathering or a team meeting. You might get silence. You might get a whole range of different answers. But the reason why I think we find it intriguing is that it's both a difficult question to answer, but it also forces us to think about what it means to be human. 7 months prior to that July day, the streets around the capital looked very different. The concern for independence had come to a boil. The Soviets were losing patience with their wayward republic, and they were starting to think maybe they had let things get too far. So in January of that year, over 3 days, the Soviet troops decided to stem the tide. Tanks rolled into the city, but the people didn't leave, and as a result, 14 people were killed and 702 were injured. So I recall talking to people at the time about their experience in that confrontation with Soviet troops. And they talked about their sort of cobbled together time, how they kept a persistent vigil of people outside of the parliament buildings, busing them from every town and village. Because they wanted to make sure that the Soviets recognized that every Lithuanian was willing to stand in front of the tanks and the guns. What caused the Lithuanians to be motivated to take such action? What grand purpose was behind their thinking? Something tells me it wasn't something that came out of a Start With Why workshop led by a management consultant. I'm embarrassed to say that might be what I would suggest. Start With Why was pioneered by Simon Sinek and is a powerful tool for helping organizations and teams reach their goals. When I first came across it, I was amazed at the way you could take all of those activities around a deep purpose to get results. But in the 1990s, the Lithuanian people didn't simply discover their purpose. It had been swirling under the surface of their society for decades. They didn't have workshops or breakout sessions. So what was behind that motivation that they experienced? And as an 18-year-old, it struck me that they were motivated out of a care for one another. If you would have asked them what people were for, they probably all would have had different answers, but they probably all would have said, not for this life of oppression, not for feeling suspicious of all of our neighbors, not for being in fear for our family or concern for the consequences of an unorthodox idea. They were motivated out of a care for one another. In our fourth industrial revolution, we don't have tanks and guns, but we have a similar sense of unease. I'm not the 18-year-old kid anymore, but the echoes of that Lithuanian experience and the tensions are still with me. I have the opportunity with my company, Domain 7, to work on organizational transformation. But there are times with it where I just have this sense of unease in my stomach about this path that we're all on in this revolution. So what is the source of that? I think it's that I see, as business leaders, we're too quick to treat the people and relationships that we have as dispensable. We see people as a pathway to success. 2 years ago, I was working with a colleague on a 2-day purpose facilitation. We were trying to help an organization connect the activities that they had to their core purpose. We are finishing our second hard-fought day of outcomes, and the meeting took a turn for the worse, frankly. The team leader decided to announce to the room that the organization was in a way worse state than everyone thought. He essentially said, if this purpose workshop doesn't pay off, we're all out of a job. The air was sucked out of the room. Everyone in that room instantly rethought of those last 2 days and looked at it in a new light. What they had thought as an opportunity to explore purpose and outcome now looked like a quick fix. So in that moment, I saw desperation turn into threats rather than togetherness. I saw purpose used as a vehicle for payoff at the expense of others. And it made me wonder, are there times when we're using purpose facilitation merely as a means of empire building? What side am I behind, the tanks of today or the flowers of today? I thought I was creating a bright future, but maybe it's a dim one. I thought I was using my purpose facilitation for good. Don't get me wrong, Start With Why is a powerful tool in this revolution. Many organizations would be much worse off with it than they are today. But if we treat people, if we're not treating people as our purpose, we're merely justifying exploitation. Our why statements are simply rationalizations of oppression. Certainly there is lots of pressure that we feel right now. And in the midst of that pressure, we revert to old patterns and ways of thinking. So I looked to my Lithuanian experience to see how they handled pressure in their moment. Did they have a significant problem? Yes, in that critical moment, not just as individuals, but the whole community was in peril. They had armed oppressors in front of them. Did they have a clear purpose? Yes, freedom and self-determination. But how did they choose to respond? They chose to respond by coming together. They linked hands, not just metaphorically, but physically across the whole Baltics, over 600 kilometers. They chose to sing songs of resistance in such an iconic and persistent way that whole Baltic movement became known as the Singing Revolution. They put people at the core of what they were doing. So what struck me is that they had a clear sense of pressure. They knew their purpose, yet they chose to put people first. Rather than desperation, they chose to sing songs, they chose to link hands and put flowers in front of the soldiers at the barricades. Rather than continuing that oppression, they pursued care of family and friends. They didn't want to sacrifice their value for one another in the pursuit of their goal. And the impact was great. There was deep courage, there was a significant commitment for one another, and the result was that there was a new sense of unity that emerged, that the path that they chose was not only got them to the goal, but it demonstrated the future they wanted to live in. So when I think of that lesson for myself today, I have to consider, what am I contributing in the present that leads to our future reality? And I have to ask myself the question, under immense pressure, with lots of ambiguity, there is no adequate purpose that justifies oppression. So I have to ask myself, how am I acting in the midst of this time? How am I answering the question, what are people for? And I think in that, I can't just look at my goals and say, are these good goals? I have to look at how I'm pursuing that with my family, with my company, and my community. And I have to say, how am I doing that in the moment? Because all of my actions are answering this question. And I think as we look towards the future and we think about the utopia of the future, we may have to shift our thinking about what people are for. And when I hear the echoes of the Lithuanian experience, I'm forced to ask myself the question, what if I were to switch from trying to build the utopia of the future rather to embodying it in the present? What if I was going to do the hard work of valuing people in the present moment? What sort of organizations would we create? What sort of change might ensue? We become so used to seeing people as a means to an end, even a noble end at times. We see our workforces and our workflows produce profit, efficiency, and maybe even that utopia that we're asking for. The world that we're looking to pursue, we say, is worth sacrificing people for. People are an input, something to be exploited. And it's amazingly ingrained in our culture, so much so that to suggest to change, to suggest to go against the grain of business, to suggest to push against our profit centers, our purpose-oriented profit centers, is scary. It's like driving your car the wrong way on the highway. It's a little crazy. And it's a lot to ask of all of us, and I feel it's a lot to ask to myself every day. And when I think of this moment that we're in, I'm brought back to some of the feelings that I had standing outside of that tunnel in Lithuania. Is there a bright future ahead or a challenging one? Is there flourishing or suffering? What I do know is that as businesses, we can't see more than a few quarters ahead. As universities, we can't adapt quickly enough to the change that's in front of us. And our relationships are stressed by constant communication and social scrutiny. But I do know that if we continue to treat others' value as a means rather than an ends, we will guarantee a future of human suffering. This past winter, my wife and I and our 2 daughters visited Lithuania again. A lot had changed, and the echoes of that day in 1991 were a distant memory or maybe a chapter in a history book. But everywhere I looked, I could see echoes of it in laughs and smiles, in a successful school or business. I was drawn back to that moment, standing outside the tunnel, and that anticipation, because the seeds of that present moment were sown in the choices to care for each other in the past. The seeds of our present moment are sown in the same choice. So I'd invite you to consider this question for yourself. The people of Lithuania were standing in front of tanks, not just to pursue a goal, but as an embodiment, as an answer to this question. The way they pursued change on those January days was a declaration of the type of world they wanted to live in. They wanted to say, we want peace, we stand for peace, we're for each other. They showed me a way towards a good future by caring about the present moment. The way we treat each other in revolution creates the world that we want to live in. Don't pursue a noble purpose and then be tricked into becoming an oppressor. And in this revolution, it's often hard to observe it, but the people in front of us aren't. So let's put people as our purpose, even if it runs against the grain and purpose of the current occupying force of our culture.